My last video, I shared about the cognitive appraisal of stress foundation. Now, how does that play into the cultural construct of trauma? What the whole series is about. Remember that trauma is on the far end of the stress spectrum, right? Trauma isn't its own nebulous thing. It is categorized in diagnostic criteria under stress. In the ICD, the International Classification of Disease, trauma disorders are labeled under diseases specifically associated with stress, or DSAS, okay? So what this means is that an individual needs to cognitively appraise a situation quickly and unconsciously, evaluate that situation as very threatening to their person, and absolutely, they do not have the resources to cope or deal both with the immediate experience as well as how that experience affects them long term. Now, the key difference between stress and trauma, like when does a situation move from stressful into traumatic, usually comes down to fear. Usually fear that one's life is in danger or the life of a loved one, okay? Also, it is very worth noting that PTSD, right, post-traumatic stress disorder, is in a very, very small percentage of people, okay? Trauma responses are completely natural reactions to a very intense situation. So let's also not pathologize very normal responses. In fact, if something huge happens, if a person is assaulted or they're trafficked and they don't have some sort of effect from that, the fact that they didn't would be more pathological and like a bigger problem than if they have been affected in some way. Okay. Now, I'm not talking just PTSD. I am talking all trauma responses, and all trauma responses are also a spectrum that includes everything from resiliency to full-blown PTSD or dissociation. Okay. So keep that in mind when we're talking about trauma responses. They are natural and they are not necessarily bad. In fact, 2/3 of people who have a single event trauma will have their trauma responses resolved with minimal intervention. Maybe counseling, just having time, community support. Most people have the resources to cope. It is perfectly natural for their bodies to be hypervigilant, to have trouble sleeping, etc. And their bodies will eventually get back to homeostasis. Now, with 1/3 of those people, they do need more assistance in their healing journey. Okay, now remember, what constitutes as trauma for one person does not necessarily mean another person in the same situation will experience that situation as trauma or traumatic. Now, caveat, most of that I just talked about, we're talking about an acute stressor, a one-off, okay, an assault, a car accident, things like that. But often, especially in the anti-trafficking space, we're talking about multiple experiences with really bad things. You might have heard the term developmental trauma or complex trauma. Now, the ICD acknowledges complex trauma, the International Classification of Disease. They do acknowledge complex trauma. The US's DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, how we in the US label, categorize, and diagnose psychological things, it does not have CPTSD or developmental trauma as an actual diagnosis, okay? There are a lot of reasons for this, but in the US, you cannot get a diagnosis of CPTSD or developmental trauma. Now, what does that mean? That means insurance covers different treatment options. It means a whole lot of stuff, which I could get into if anyone is curious about that later. But be aware of that if you're in the US, it is not recognized here. The other key point to remember is that the term trauma does not mean the event, okay? For our purposes and in our work, trauma is the long-lasting impact of an event that affects a person in a negative way. Basically, they are responding to the present as if they were still in the past, all right? Now, if anyone is interested after this series, I could talk about the why and how we respond to something based on our past experiences. But for now, that is a decent foundation for stress and trauma and how we actually get to the experience of stress or trauma. Okay, so take that. That is the first part in this series that I was kind of talking about. We will tomorrow move on to cultural expressions of distress. We'll talk about that. Then again, we'll talk about kind of a linguistics aspect, and then we're going to merge all of this together. But for now, this is the foundation of stress and trauma and how we experience it. So if you have any questions, please let me know.